Welcome to week 11 of the QUT Design Lab series of videos supporting our program based on Wendy Laura Belcher's second edition of Writing Your Journal Article in 12 Weeks. I acknowledge the Turrbal and Yagara peoples as the traditional custodians of the unceded lands in Meanjin, where I'm now recording this, and I recognise that these lands and waterways have always been places of teaching, learning, research, creativity, storytelling, and arts. I'm your writing wellbeing coach, Dr. Abby Winter, and this week we're going to be getting into the weeds of editing sentences. First, as always, our reflection. Do you know you have any grammar or writing weaknesses? This week we're going to be looking at the second part of the microstructure of writing, the level of words and sentences. Last week we looked at the parts of your piece that could be thought of as the primacy, the first part, your title and introduction, and recency, the last part, your conclusion, to take terms from learning theory, and big bits of the microstructure. The week before, we looked at the macrostructure, the big bits of organizing and structuring your article around your evidence and argument. The first thing Belcher talks about in this week's chapter is the importance of making your introduction good. That's why I asked those doing the QUT Design Lab program to send through your introductions for homework, and why those who did should have been emailed back a multicoloured delight, and we'll get to what that all means very soon. But first, Belcher reminds us that there are actually only 4 types of changes we can make to any text. We can add to it, we can delete from it, we can substitute one word for another, or we can rearrange where the words go. Belcher spends this week's chapter talking about those 4 things in the context of her online Belcher editing diagnostic test, where she uses 5 colours, because sometimes we're not quite sure what actually needs to be done. In Belcher's diagnostic output, red indicates things to delete, green indicates substitutes, blue is for substitute or add, purple is cut or substitute, and orange is cut. This is the first page of an article in progress that I've been working on with a couple of colleagues, which I've run through Belcher's test, and which we're going to use to understand what all of her colours mean for improving our writing. Before we start, don't get too overwhelmed. Belcher recommends working through a colour a day because there is a lot going on there. First, the red. These are any time that and or appear. Belcher's macro thinks that and or are indicators of lists, and they should be deleted. The first kind she talks about are doublings or false lists, where you're using 2 synonyms instead of just one, like the third line of my introduction to this article, where I liken ideas to the eruption of matter at the end of a star's life, or to the explosions of colour during the paint throwing of the festival Holi. It's highlighted that it's up to me to decide whether or not to act on it by cutting one of them to make it briefer. The next type of list is the all-inclusive one. I don't have an example of that here, but the one she uses in the book is that rather than saying the medical interns, residents, fellows, and attendings gather for the lecture, it would be better to say the physicians gathered for the lecture. Third is a non-inclusive list, where you've listed a lot of things, but not anywhere near everything. Again, I don't have an example of this in mind, but if it's reading a bit like a shopping list, it's a good candidate for revision. Fourth is a flipped list, where you start with the list instead of introducing and contextualizing it. And her example in the book on page 213 lists all sorts of things about music before mentioning the actual musicians being discussed. Fifth is a disordered list. Usually, we want things in increasing importance or size. Millimeters, centimeters, meters, and kilometers makes more sense to our brains than centimeters, kilometers, meters, and millimeters, even though that second list was ordered alphabetically. She also recommends that words with fewer syllables should come first. Pears, apples, bananas, and avocados. Same with phrases with fewer words coming before longer phrases. The final type of list is a non-parallel list, which again, I don't have an example of, but they do make my skin crawl. But it's basically where you put different words at the start of the list. Belcher's example in the book is, during the week-long demonstration, students did all sorts of things, including acting as security, van driving, administrative liaisons, and by cooking and serving food. That by before cooking and serving food just makes it wrong. although it's actually the phrase administrative liaisons that's incorrect. You could put by at the start of the list and it would work for the others. So my trick for this one, which I actually started doing back when QUT was changing its teaching evaluations to bring in the Lex, which I now think 4 student evaluation schemas have been since then, is to read aloud each item in the list and make sure it makes sense with the STEM word. Okay. The next colour to handle is green, which is highlighting verbs that you might want to strengthen by substituting a different word for. Most of the green that's highlighted for me is the word is. I do have a couple of get that I could substitute for a better word, but the other one it highlights for me, been, I'd actually do like and I wouldn't change. But Belcher goes through the 3 types of verbs you might want to play with on pages 314 to 317. First are nominalizations or buried verbs. That's where you take a nice strong verb like she explained and turn it into a noun version by saying she gave the explanation. Second are what she calls weak verbs, and that's why all of my is's are highlighted green, because they might be examples of weakness. Instead of saying Abby is a student of, it is stronger to say Abby studies. The third type of bad verbs are those that create the passive voice, where things are magically happening with no one actually doing anything. The conclusions were drawn, rather than we conclude. All right. Next on the list are the blue highlights, which are pronouns that you might need to substitute or add more words around. And she goes through those on pages 317 to 20. If you look at mine, it's all of the this, that, there, then, and whose. And there are 5 types of problem pronouns they might be. First are empty pronouns, where you should be using a verb and moving the subject up to the front of your sentence. Second are unclear antecedents, where you need to rewrite to make clearer which subject, noun, is being referred to. I love her example on page 318. The experiment survived the power failure because of the university's backup generator, but it soon grew overheated and then it was ruined. Obviously, the first it refers to the generator and the second refers to the experiment, so that's a fairly easy one to rewrite. The other types are dangling constructions, where the pronoun doesn't refer to the subject of the clause before it. Absent nouns, where this, these, or those are used without any noun in sight. Or premature pronouns, where they're used before the thing they're referring to. Belcher's example is, if she had taken to heart all the criticism of her research, Margaret Mead might never have published. And the solution is just to swap the she at the start and the Margaret Mead later. Okay. Next on the list are the purples, which are the prepositions, words like of, at, by, to, with, and as. Belcher suggests cutting or substituting them because either you're using a lot of them in one sentence, or they're wordy clutter and unnecessary to the clarity of what you're writing. Finally come the oranges, which the Belcher test says are unnecessary words and should just be cut. In the macro, those mostly come through as grey. And as I may have said before, the macro is a dumb machine. So it's highlighted words within words, like off, in coffee. So Belcher's tests highlights 3 types of unnecessary words. Firstly, negatives. If the word not is in there, it will be highlighted because it's better to use a positive than the more awkward negative version. Say, it is common, rather than it is not uncommon. Next are weak adjectives or adverbs like very, or those that end in ly, because you could be more specific. Quick refresher. An adjective is a describer for a noun. Sweet red apple. And an adverb is a modifier for an adjective. Say, very, or adverb, very quickly. And I have a double whammy in mine. Isn't directly related, so I've done a negative as well as the ly form of direct. Finally, are adverb particles like in, out, off, on, up, or away. The plane took off, he looked away. And apparently I use these quite a bit. Off is there 3 times in that page, so I might reconsider some of those in the next edit. The macro also highlights some of the oranges as pink. Those are the sandwich words, embedded clauses that add description and possibly unnecessary words to your word count. For example, In the sentence, Susie, who is very sporty, likes to play cricket outside of school, you don't really need the who is very sporty clause because the rest of the sentence pretty much gives you that context. Now, Belcher isn't the only one out there with a diagnostic test you can put your writing through. Helen Sword has one on her Writer's Diet website, and I've put that same document of mine through it. First, though, I used the cog picture to change the settings. Her default is whether your writing is flabby or fit. I prefer her swampy or solid metaphor, but there are others you can choose from. That's how this one looks. You'll see that this one has highlighted some of the same things as the Belcher test and some that are different. In many ways, this one is cleaner, and it has her whole book, also called The Writer's Diet, to help you make sense of how to make your writing better. As with most writerly things, I have a couple more useful additional resources. Claire Aitchison wrote a lovely blog post about grammar in 2021. And it refers to some other useful articles, Dunleavy's BBC test and Morell's working and glue words. Stephen Postula wrote a very short book back in 1996 called Don't Panic, A Procrastinator's Guide to Writing an Effective Term Paper. And it's got a few useful pages on passive voice and vague verbs. Today's been a lot of me talking, but next week is our final week. So apart from planning and tracking your writing time, your job is to go back to the place you're thinking of sending your piece that you first looked at back in week 4 and check what their requirements are. Or of course, if you're done, send it off. I'll see you next week.